For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you. And you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of birds according to their kinds, of animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every kind shall come into you, to keep them alive. Also, take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all God's commanded him.
Hi, I'm Jacob.
Hi, I'm Nina.
Hi, I'm Mike.
And this is the Fig Tree Podcast. Okay, so this week we are picking up after the creation story, from the beginnings of human civilization to the flood, all the way to the Tower of Babel. But before we start, let's check in. How's everybody doing?
I'm doing great. We're out of the threat of fires. We're done with the annual meeting, and Mike is a happy camper.
Yes, it was great to have some rain. Not biblical amount of rain, but we had a little bit that calmed everything down, and things are looking so fresh and clean right here.
Yeah, I'm doing good. The rain was indeed a blessing. It was very nice, and we've really been blessed with some nice cold weather. So I'm glad that the fires are hopefully over. So, as I said, we are talking about the other part of the first half of Genesis today. The book of Genesis, it's usually understood to be split into 2 parts. There's that first half, which is Genesis 1 through 11, and we'll talk about that today. It's sometimes called the Primordial History. And the second half, which we'll cover next week, is the covenant with Abraham and all of the patriarchal narratives. Now, you may remember last time how we talked about the way that the creation story isn't necessarily meant to communicate exact or scientific history, but it rewrites that general understanding of the creation from that part of the ancient world to tell us who God is and who we are. Well, the remainder of Genesis 1 through 11 basically works this way. It's meant to give a quick overview of ancient human history to tell us again about humanity, especially how things have gone wrong with us, and about God, both God's justice and God's covenant love for humanity. The primordial history, it really works through a few major stories tied together with genealogies. I'm sure those are everyone's favorite part, right? First, as we talked about last week, are the creation narratives. But then we hear about Cain, Abel, and Seth, which then flows into that story about Lamech.
So immediately after the creation narratives, we have the story about Adam and Eve's children, Cain and Abel. So in chapter 4, verse 1, Eve gives birth to Cain, saying, "I have got me a man with the help of the Lord." You guys like that?
I like it.
This possibly calls back to that prophecy in Genesis 3:15 when God promises to send a son who will destroy the serpent. We talked about that. So she says, "I have got me a man," presumably thinking that this is the man that God was referring to. So Adam and Eve then also give birth to Abel. And when they grow up, Abel is a keeper of sheep and Cain is a tiller of the ground. And they both make offerings to God, but God only accepts Abel's. Now, no reason is given exactly why, but there's one narrative clue. As regards to Abel's offering, it says he brought it from the choice firstlings of his flock, while Cain is said to have brought of the fruit of the soil. So Cain brings a regular portion of his crop, but Abel brings the best part of his flock. So you can imagine what God liked more. So Cain becomes very angry and jealous about all this, and the Lord warns him that sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. And right after this, Cain asks Abel to come out of the fields, and then he kills him. So God then asks Cain, "Where's your brother?" And he gives like this really snarky answer. "Am I my brother's keeper?" That question, that phrase is part of our modern lexicon. But Cain lies, saying he doesn't know. And God says, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." That's really sad. "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and wanderer on the earth." Notice here that similarity to Adam's judgment, where God says, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil shall you eat of it all the days of your life." So Cain naturally despairs at this fate, saying that others are going to kill him. So God promises him that anyone who harms him will receive vengeance sevenfold, which means complete, and puts a mark on Cain so that everyone who sees him will know this. Then after Cain's story, we hear about his descendants who are said to originate various crafts and trades. They culminate in a guy named Lamech. Lamech is representative of the direction of humanity. Unfortunately, he is much worse than Cain. He is the first person in the Bible to marry multiple women and treating them like property. And he recites this poem where he brags about how he kills anyone who lays a hand on him, and that if Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold. So Lamech is a man of intense violence and depravity. So you can see with him that human civilization is starting to spiral out of control.
Have you ever met anyone like Lamech?
Oh dear. I don't know, Mike. Maybe you have.
So I might have been considered in my day a Lamech.
Truly.
So, because, and even Cain, right? Because I was selfish, self-centered, driven by fear, self-deluded, full of self-pity, and I was running the show. So my agenda was the most important agenda, right? So basically, I was my own God.
There's this quote from Evelyn Underhill where she talks about how, like, our affliction is the tyranny of the I, the me, and the mine. And it's, I think, really present in these stories and in what you said, Mike, about how when these things go wrong and these things that we call sin, right, it really is this obsessive interest in ourselves and in our own interests.
And it is what I truly suffer from, right, and why I need a God.
Right, right.
Exactly. Well, hope is not lost in this story because Adam and Eve have another son, Seth. And his line is the one that began to invoke the name of the Lord. As we can see through the genealogy, God's favor is on the descendants of Seth, and eventually getting to the birth of Noah.
So what's with these guys living for hundreds of years?
Yeah. So, there's different ways of thinking about that. One of the problems actually with the ages is that in different versions of the Hebrew Bible, there's actually different numbers. So in the Septuagint, for example, which is the Greek translation, which reflects another like Hebrew tradition, the numbers are just completely different. So, there was this old practice of adding up all these numbers to get the age of the world, right? And that's where you get that 6,000 years thing. But the problem with that is that we really don't know what the numbers originally were anyway. And then add on to that, there's this ancient practice of when you're trying to make somebody really important in your narrative. So there's these Mesopotamian kings who are said to have lived for thousands of years. So when you're trying to illustrate the importance of somebody, you make them live for a really, really long time. So the most probable thing that's going on is not that these people are living for 700 years, but actually that the narrative is using this as a device to make them important.
Well, in the genealogy of Noah, we hear about the oldest man in the Bible. Do you remember his name?
I don't.
It starts with an M.
Methuselah?
It's Methuselah,
Yeah.
of course. And do you remember how old he is when he
I
finally
don't.
dies? 969 years.
Oh, dang.
It's a great little fun fact to memorize.
That is a fun fact.
So after the genealogy from Seth, we get to the story of Noah. And everyone knows this story. It's so popular with kids. I mean, let's face it, the imagery is used to decorate babies' rooms and cribs. And because of the rainbows and the animals, it's like pretty hard to resist. And I've taught this story to 5th and 6th graders for many years. And they have some really interesting questions. Like, what animals didn't die in the flood? Does anyone know the answer to that one?
A fish.
The fish didn't die, right? Because they're in the water all the time,
Yeah.
which is pretty profound if you think about it.
Mm-hmm. You know how there's the fish symbol that was really popular in Christian, early Christian communities and then later on?
The ichthys?
Yeah, that's right. There's this quote from Tertullian about fishes, and he's connecting baptism and the primordial waters, or the waters at the beginning of creation. And he talks about how we are little fishes according to the ichthys, Jesus Christ, in whom we are born, and we only live by remaining in the water. And so he connects this to how the fishes were brought out of the primordial waters. So we are like little fishes brought out from baptism, which I thought was quite interesting.
Another question always is, when they're on that ark, why didn't the lions eat the squirrels? Well, if you read the scripture closely, you'll learn that they're vegetarians. They were actually given permission to eat meat after they got off the ark. So that makes a lot of sense. Mike, what did you learn in Sunday school about this flood?
So I remember being in Sunday school at the Baptist church, and them and asking about what happened to the dinosaurs. And they said that the dinosaurs were too big to fit in the ark, and that they froze in the flood, and they called it the Ice Age.
Okay, very good. Well, let's go back to the story of Noah. Back to the beginning. Humanity is continuing to spiral out of control. So first we hear about the Nephilim, which is always fascinating. They're often thought of as children of fallen angels and human women, or of violent, powerful kings. The term sons of God could refer to either. But either way, these Nephilim are understood to be very big, very powerful, and violent themselves. And then the story says that God says that the wicked of humanity was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. Wow. And it says that this grieved him to his heart, and he was sorry he made humanity, so he decides to destroy them. But it says that Noah found favor in God's sight. There's so many things that we learn about God compared to what some of the competing stories are within the culture at that time. And this is one of them, that God is paying attention and God notices. So God tells Noah of his plans, and he instructs him in exact detail to make an ark, and promises him that he is going to make a covenant. Remember, that's a promise or a contract with Noah and his family to save them. And he instructs them to bring 2 of every animal into the ark with him. So Noah builds the ark. So Mike, you know about boats because you're a boat captain. What do you think about this ark? Why is it called an ark?
So an ark is God's container for God's treasures.
Really?
Yeah.
So a lot of people think an ark just means boat, like it's just a synonym, but you're saying it actually extends beyond that.
Yeah, because there's the Ark of the Covenant and all those things.
Oh,
And we have the keel of the Ark. If you look up in the chapel, there's like a keel and some ribs, like the beginning of them building a boat.
that's
Yeah.
right.
It's a really common motif in church architecture is that the nave, which is why it's called the nave, is always shaped like a boat to be the ark.
Right. And have you all ever heard that the basket that baby Moses was put in to float down the river was also called an ark? It contains God's treasures. So it's not just a boat, which is what a lot of people think. So anyway, Noah builds the ark and brings on his people and 2 of every living creature. And then God sends the flood, and the rain falls for 40 days and 40 nights, and the world then floods for another 40 days, and the water covers everything, even the highest mountains. And it says that all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all human beings. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died, even the dinosaurs. Right, Mike?
Even the dinosaurs.
Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. But it said that God remembered Noah. God didn't just leave them, floating out there, right? Remembered Noah and all the animals with him in the ark, and he made a wind blow over the earth to make the waters recede. And after 150 days, the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat, which we believe is in modern-day Turkey. And soon the mountain tops would appear. And then, after 40 days, Noah sends out a raven, which went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove, which found no place to land and came back. And after 7 days he sent it again, and it returned with an olive branch, and he knew that the waters had subsided. After another 7 days he sent it out again, and it did not come back this time. So then God sends Noah and his family out in the ark, and tells them to be fruitful and multiply on the earth. He then blesses them and gives to them all the animals and plants as food, and warns that whenever humans kill one another, he will require a reckoning, because humans are made in God's image. Nevertheless, God makes a covenant to never again destroy humanity, and the sign of the covenant is his bow, which he sets in the sky. Jacob, tell us more about this bow, because it's such a common image, and it's like such a feel-good, happy, thing to have a rainbow, and kids love to draw them, but there's a lot to this bow.
Yes,
it's more than you might think.
When I was a kid, I thought it meant like a bow, like a piece of cloth, that you'd put on something, and so that was kind of always how I pictured it. And it wasn't until a long time later that I realized, or actually learned, that it's actually not a cloth bow. It's a bow and arrow. So a rainbow obviously is shaped kind of like a bow and arrow. And the point of it is that God turns his bow towards himself. So the arrow is not pointed at humanity or at the world, but instead it's pointed back at God.
Right, and so many of us think that when we see a rainbow, it's a reminder that God has promised that God will never inundate the world again. But that reminder is actually for God, and we just happen to see it, which is very interesting.
So did all of this really happen?
Yeah, so in the same way that you remember like the creation narrative, we talked about historicity and how really what's going on is that they're taking narratives that were present in the world around them and kind of rewriting them to tell us about God and about humanity. Well, this story is pretty much like that. So maybe one way to illustrate this is to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the flood narrative of Gilgamesh, which was written before the Hebrew Bible, and it was written around Sumeria, Well, in the flood narrative of Gilgamesh, we begin with the humans creating a city on the Euphrates River. And they build very quickly, and eventually the god Enlil gets angry because he can't sleep. And it's because of all this noise of construction. I don't know if you've ever lived right next to a construction zone, but I kind of get that. So he gathers all the gods together, and they all agree, let's destroy humanity. The god Ea, however, decides to appear to a human king, Utnapishtim, in a dream, and he instructs him to build a gigantic boat, telling him the exact structure and dimensions. So Utnapishtim agrees, and with a group of builders, he puts together this boat. And after building it, he packs it with gold and wine and animals, and he boards it with his family and launches it into the water and seals every opening. And then that following morning, the storm begins. It's led by the storm god Adad and the sea gods, Nergal, Ninurta, and Anunnaki. Now the deluge is so bad that it scares even the gods, and they all begin to regret their destruction of humanity. And so the storm continues 6 days and 6 nights, until on the 7th day, the storm ends and the sea calms. Utnapishtim comes out of the boat and sees all the water around, but off in the distance there's a mountain. For another 6 days they sail, and on the 7th Utnapishtim releases a dove, which returns to him, and then a swallow, which also returns. And he finally releases a raven, which does not come back, evidently having found a place to land. So he opens up the boat and makes a burning sacrifice to the gods, which they really like. Now all of them except Enlil gather together to agree to remember the flood. And Enlil, upon finding out, is enraged that some of the humans survived. But Ea confronts him and calms him down. And at the end of the story, Ea goes down to Utnapishtim on the boat and tells and blesses him and his wife, saying, "In time past, Utnapishtim was a mortal man. Henceforth he and his wife shall live in the distance at the mouth of the rivers. And thus Utnapishtim and his wife are made immortal, to live like the gods." So there's all of these similarities between the stories, but I think there's some differences too, right?
There are, and looking at these differences is so important to understand what the ancient Hebrews were believing about God and what has been passed down to us. First, in Gilgamesh, the gods destroy on a whim. They are annoyed by humanity and decide to destroy them as a result. But in the Noah story, God is not annoyed. He's grieved by the darkness that humanity has given into and destroys to get rid of the darkness. But second, in the Gilgamesh narrative, Utnapishtim acts without the knowledge of most of the gods, outsmarting them with the assistance of the rebellious god Ea. But in the Noah story, God always plans to preserve humanity through Noah and his family. He never wants to fully wipe humanity out. Third, while the Gilgamesh narrative does include the preservation of animals, they're more of an afterthought. In the Noah story, God is concerned to fully preserve his creation and puts every animal on the ark, 2 by 2. God is caring. I know a question a child once posed to me was, who closed the door? If everybody's on board, who's going to close the door before the rain starts? Do you all know the answer?
I don't.
It's in the Bible. God closed the door. That's how much God cares. So fourth, in the Gilgamesh narrative, the gods primarily reward Utnapishtim and his wife. But in the Noah story, there's a clear covenant made between God and all of humanity, wherein he reaffirms humanity's vocation and promises never to destroy in this way again. But after the Noah story, the spiral unfortunately continues. First, there's a bit about Noah's own spiral, how he plants a vineyard to reestablish that connection between humanity and the earth. But he ends up getting very drunk. And then something bad happens. It's not really clear. It's pretty symbolic. It's probably something that you wouldn't want your children to read. But it happens while he's passed out, unfortunately. And then he curses his son Ham and his son Canaan. And then genealogy reports how the lineage of Noah becomes all the various nations around Israel. But then you have this story in chapter 11 about the Tower of Babel. The whole world speaks one language, and they come up with a revolutionary new technology, bricks. So they decide to make a lot of them, and they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So they begin building. And God observes that because they are all working together and are unimpeded by language, they will keep building up into the heavens. So he sends the heavenly host down to confuse their languages, and suddenly they're unable to understand one another, and they scatter all across the earth.
Okay, so that's like a really good summary of all of those stories. But like what's going on in these stories?
So they all these stories, chapters 1 through 11, they all reflect a similar pattern and a trajectory. So in the first place, we might continue to refer to it as the spiral. Things go downhill for humanity, and they continue to spiral further and further into these depths of darkness. But the spiral motif only accounts for the human action in the story. To get a fuller picture, we need to think about God's actions in the story. In each story, God executes justice on the darkness and the actions of humanity, but then has mercy, entering into covenant again with them. So the movement could be summarized this way: spiral, judgment, and then covenant. Trying again.
So each of these stories has this motif in it. So like with Spiral, for example, as we've already noted, all of these stories have this downward trajectory for humanity. The Spiral in Cain and Abel and the Lamech stories shows how humanity gives in to violence and killing. Note how there's that progression from Cain to Lamech, right? Cain avenges sevenfold, but Lamech avenges 77-fold. Right? So there's this kind of intensification of violence and killing. It gets worse over time.
Sounds like they're building momentum.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And then you get to the Noah story, and you see that humanity has spun just completely out of control. They've hit rock bottom, as it were. So that all they can even think about is wickedness. It begins to consume everything. Mike, do you have something you want to say there?
Well, sure. I have plenty of spirals or relapses or slips or whatever you call, and a lot of them were like Noah's, where I couldn't really remember what happened and who did what to me, and God always came back, and I was always able to redo my covenant with God, and save me. As long as I'd stop playing God and let God play God, then I would stop spiraling.
So there's this way in which, like, this kind of spiral down gets moved into something else, right? And so, well, before we get there, we'll just briefly address Babel. In Babel, we also see the spiral of the hubris of mankind. So this is a different kind of spiral, isn't it?
Well, and I'm sure that in some of my spirals, I probably babbled a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure. So Babel, they want to be like God, right? There's this motif in Scripture of the mountain. It reaches all the way up into heaven, and that's kind of where heaven meets earth, right?
Right. They're actually trying to build their way up to heaven.
Exactly. They're trying to build their own mountain. And it's kind of locking onto this ancient architectural thing called a ziggurat. And basically that was an ancient like pyramid, as it were. So in the story of Babel, we see all of this hubris, right? We talked about the I, the me, and the mine earlier, right? Now it's kind of like that, but for all of us. It represents the hubris of not just one person, but a whole civilization. And I think we can kind of see this through history, right? Is that when we all get together and build great technology, for example, there are ways in which that can go very well, but there's also ways in which that can spiral out of control, and we can do these really awful, terrible things. And that's actually part of the reason it's called Babel. It's a reference to Babylon, which is the big, bad empire of the time. So in each of these stories, there's a spiral, but there's also a judgment. There's judgment from God. But these stories aren't just like talking about how mad God is. It teaches us what God's judgment actually is. So we begin with Cain and Abel. In the story of Cain and Abel, God judges Cain by cursing his work with the soil and by making him wander the earth. But note how God shows restraint on Cain. He ensures that nobody will kill him. But then there's Noah. There's another judgment, obviously. The flood represents God's judgment over the entire world. This time, I think it's really important to note that God is sad, not angry, and that he determines to save his creation through the judgment. There's this old theme, there's this kind of way of seeing it, as that the flood is decreation. You remember last time how we talked about the waters above and the waters below, and how that's really important to the creation story?
Yeah, it's like a tub either filling up from the spigot up high and also like the water coming up from the drain.
Exactly. The waters, the kind of primordial waters, are coming back together again. And so it's a complete destruction, but it's a recreation, right? Because out of these waters comes new life. And so the flood is also a kind of cleansing, a washing of the world. But finally, you've got Babel. God judges Babel as well in scattering them and giving them all different languages. So humans cooperate together to do evil, and God judges it not by punishing them necessarily, but by ensuring that they can't follow through on their worst impulses. So we've got those two movements, but then finally you've got covenant.
So we read all through the Bible how God is always reapproaching humanity with a new form of covenant. So with Cain, he makes a covenant. He promises Cain that no one will kill him and even gives him a mark to show this covenant. And with Noah, God makes this covenant with all of creation. It's an unconditional promise saying that, he will keep his wrath from humanity forever. And again, that symbol is the rainbow. But for us, it's something we get to see. It's like God's little Post-it note, his little reminder of what he promised us. And then in Babel, God doesn't quite make a covenant, as Jacob said, but God intervenes. And this leads towards a covenant with Abraham, which is what we're going to cover next week. God is always trying to protect humanity from themselves.
So God really does kind of like protect us from ourselves.
It's called God's grace.
We talked about it a little bit last week where I let go of God's hand all the time, but God never lets go of mine. Mm-hmm. And all my spirals and falling downs and slips and relapses and mistakes I've made playing God, God has always been there to pick me back up and always been there to show me the way and always been there to save me after the flood.
Right. It's like God is saying, Mike, let's try again. Yeah, that's God's grace.
God shows his grace most, though, in Jesus, right? And we find Jesus in all of these stories. It might seem counterintuitive because Jesus doesn't come until a long time later. But I'll just throw out a few ways that Jesus is found in these stories. So first, in the Noah story, not in the Noah story, in the Cain and Abel story, Jesus is found through Seth. So Adam and Eve, they have this disaster happen to them, right? They have these two sons, and then one of them kills the other one, and everything's gone wrong. But God sends another son, And you see this motif through the story that there's this chosen line through Seth. And so this all leads towards Jesus. And you can see this when you read the genealogies in the New Testament, that there's always this chosen line, this chosen people through which God is working in order to bring about the salvation of his people. But then in the Noah story, you also find Jesus. We already kind of referenced it, but that whole story by the early church was used as a kind of reference point for baptism. You can read it in 1 Peter, for example, where Peter says, "For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he also went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were saved through water. And baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ." So what we find in the Bible and in the early church is this connection between the kind of destruction of the flood and the renewal that it brings with the way that baptism works. There's this Catholic theologian named John Danielou, and he says it this way. He says that as sinful humanity in the time of Noah was destroyed by a judgment of God in the midst of the water, and one just man was saved to be the firstborn of a new human race, so in baptism, the old man is annihilated by the means of the sacrament of water, and the man who comes out of the baptismal pool, I might add the man or woman who comes out of the baptismal pool, belongs to the new creation. So there's this motif of decreation and recreation, which we find both in the flood and in baptism. And not only this, baptism is the sign. So you remember the rainbow.
Yes.
And how if we look at the rainbow, we remember God's covenant with humanity. Well, when we look at our baptism, we remember God's covenant with us. And then finally, we have Babel. Do you want to talk about Babel?
Right. So that ancient story of the Tower of Babel, which, by the way, is not shared with any other of the ancient cultures and their stories. It's unique to our Bible. So this story continues from Genesis and actually moves on into Acts. So, Jacob, do you know what event in the Acts of the Apostles is actually the reversal of the Tower of Babel?
Pentecost?
Pentecost, that's right. Jesus ascended, and then as promised, several days later, the Holy Spirit came down and felt like flames on the heads and tongues of the apostles. It would be like eating a bunch of red hots or hot tamales, right? That's what the kids like to do on Pentecost. So they were fired up, and they could understand all in Jerusalem.
Right. So just as the people in Babel couldn't understand their common language anymore, suddenly all of these diverse languages in Pentecost come together so everyone can understand one another. I think there's another similarity too, in which just as in Babel, everyone came together for their hubris, right? So they all come together to build this structure to glorify themselves. In Pentecost, it says afterwards that they all shared everything in common, and they did all of this work together to build not a tower up into the heavens, but to build the church.
Exactly, and that required going out to the 4 corners of the earth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Just like what happened with the Tower of Babel, but
That's
now
right.
with a very, very different commission.
Yeah. So we find Jesus then in all of these stories, because really that's what the Bible is doing. It's showing God's covenant love for us throughout the Old Testament all the way into the New. And of course, as Christians, we believe that God's covenant love finds its culmination in Jesus.
And no matter what we do, God is always doing something new with who we are and what we are.
That's right. Okay, well, so this episode went a little longer than last time, but we'll try to keep it a little shorter in the future. But next time, we will continue talking about God's covenant love as we embark upon the story of Abraham. Thanks for listening to the Fig Tree Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this podcast on social media so others can join us. We hope that you have a great day, and we'll see you next time on the Fig Tree Podcast.